Okay, well, I apologize for getting a slow start today. I was having trouble setting things up, and this morning, every time I tried to plan in advance, somebody interrupted me. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about Plato's theory of knowledge. We've already talked some about an externalist perspective on knowledge, which is natural from a certain kind of empiricist perspective. Today we're going to be talking about Plato's perspective, which is actually much older and much more traditional within the Western tradition. In India, most people have been externalists. That's sort of the natural way people approach the question of what knowledge is. It's a true belief that arises from a reliable source, like perception, or inference, or testimony, and so on. In the West, people haven't thought about it that way. They've thought about it in a different and more internalist way. And so we're going to look at the standard sort of approach to knowledge in Western philosophy, at any rate, standard up until 1967, which is really the first point at which in the West people introduced an alternative to this. So we'll talk about, again, this question of what is knowledge. And here I'm just reminding you of some things we've already talked about, but just sort of to get your brain back on the right path. Everybody agrees that knowledge implies truth. You can't know what isn't so. And so if I know that it's Friday, today is Friday, right? I cannot know that today is Friday unless it is Friday. And so that's something that's uncontroversial. Knowledge is truth. A second thing, almost as uncontroversial, today is Friday. Well, if those two things are right, then we might take an initial stab at understanding what knowledge is by saying knowledge is true belief. And so in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, where he discusses the question of knowledge, that's the first suggestion introduced. Well, actually, the first suggestion is that knowledge is just perception. To know something is just to see. And we've already talked about the reasons why that really isn't quite enough. You might remember, the problem really is that you might be just completely accidentally right. So if a belief is true, but just accidentally, not because of anything you've done, it's just maybe you've been hypnotized into having this belief, and it turns out to be true, we wouldn't want to call that knowledge. So there might be a variety of ways in which we could, so by definition, knowledge we could say is warranted true belief, but that really just raises something I don't know what that has to be added, warrant. Okay, so knowledge is warranted true. To say that it's external, it involves some other kind of relationship with the world, like arising from a reliable process of belief formation. Or we could say something else. We could say, well, I'll skip through the example, but the basic idea is we could also say, no, it's a matter of how that mental state connects to other mental states. The belief part has to do with our mental state. That's an internal component. The truth part has to do with the relation to the world, and so that's an external component. Then what is warrant like? Is it more like truth or more like belief? Is it external or is it internal? The externalist, as we've seen, says it's something else. It's some other kind of relation to the world. The internalist says, no, it's some other kind of relation to other mental states. We, after all, know what kind of mental state an item of knowledge is. It's a belief. Then the question is really, well, what else could it be? It must be a matter of its relation to other mental states. So let's try to think about that. Suppose we try to distinguish knowledge from other mental states like belief, desire, hope, wonder, doubt, and so on. You might have all sorts of attitudes about tomorrow's game. I know the Longhorns will win. I think the Longhorns will win. I want the Longhorns to win. I hope they win. I wonder whether they'll win. I doubt whether they'll win. All of those are different attitudes, you might say, about the same proposition that they will win. And so we might think, okay, what makes knowledge different from all of those? What kind of relationship to other mental states? Well, if I am knowing, actually that's not really grammatical, but if I know that the Longhorns will win, as opposed to just believe it or hope it or guess it or predict it or something like that, what would have to be true? What would have to be true of my belief? Yeah. We'll take any kind of stat, right? And what makes knowledge different from just a guess?
It's going to happen.
Well, okay, yes, it has to actually happen, right? So, right, one thing is, look, I can think they'll win without them winning. I can want them to win without them winning. I can hope they win, but that doesn't guarantee.
By evidence.
Yeah, okay, good. I have to have evidence for it, right? I have to have some reasons.
I was going to say reasoning.
Okay, yeah, reasoning behind it. So you might say one thing that, look, if somebody says, I hope the Longhorns win, you say, why? You know, something that somebody could ask, especially if your favorite team is not an obvious one to root for or something. But we ordinarily don't think you have to provide evidence for your hope or your evidence for your desire. But you do have to be in a position of providing evidence in favor of something you're said to know, right? If you claim to know it, then you should be able to give reasons for it. You should be able to give an argument of some kind. You should, in short, be able to justify it. So the internalist says there's something about the relationship between a belief and other mental states, like mental states that give evidence, that give arguments, that give reasons, in order for this to count as knowledge. So we're going to distinguish knowledge of justification, two other mental states. And indeed, that's what Plato does near the end of the Theaetetus. He introduces this definition of knowledge. He says, let's consider knowledge justified true belief. That is to say, true belief with an account, with reasons, with evidence, with some kind of argument, with some kind of explanation of why you think it's true. You've got to be able to give reasons to count as knowing something. Now, if we think about that definition, you have to be able, that right, do you have to be able to give reasons? Here is what Theaetetus says in the dialogue. This is a distinction, Socrates, which I heard made by someone else, but I had forgotten. He said the true opinion combined with reason was knowledge, but that the opinion which had no reason was out of the sphere of knowledge, and that things of which there is no rational account are not knowable. Such was the singular expression. 2 points that are actually being made here. One is, if it's the kind of thing we could know, there must be some reason, there must be some explanation we could give. And then, of course, we count as knowing it only if we actually combine that opinion with reason, if we can actually give that, give reasons for my belief. And so it must rest on something else. I can explain why that's true. But now, what about my explanation? What about that evidence, those reasons, that argument? If you say, well, how do you know those? I've got to be able to give reasons for them, too, in turn. And so I keep having to have explanations or reasons or arguments or evidence for other things that are reasons or evidence or arguments. And then the question is, does this go on forever? Is this an infinite regress? In other words, why do you think that? Why do you think the Longhorns will win? Well, blah, 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 blah. Why do you think any of that? Well, blah, 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 blah. Why do you think any of that? Blah, blah, blah. And does this go on forever? Now, actually, sometimes when I watch sports shows, I'm convinced it does go on forever. Or at least, I don't know, it seems like people's reasoning often doesn't really amount to much, and there is this sort of, weird aspect to it. But here's the puzzle. What ultimately happens there? As we'll see, this dialogue actually ends with a kind of trilemma for the person who adopts this view. And what most people have done is say, look, it doesn't go on forever. At some point, the regress stops, and there are certain things that are foundational. Those things are called the given. Those are the things that are just basic, that really end up being known directly in some sense. That, on a classical way of thinking about it, are self-evident. They justify themselves. So we'll think of something you know as resting on other things you know, and that rests on yet other things you know, and eventually you get back to these things that are just known directly, are the ultimate things known. And so we have this sort of picture, kind of a layer cake picture of knowledge, according to the foundationalist view. We've got a justification of the things at the top in terms of more basic things. Those are justified in terms of still more basic things, and so on. And finally, we get down to the level of the given, which have no separate justification. That's just raw. Well, what could be like that? Is there such a thing as the given? Something that really is foundational, that we would know directly without appeal to any further argument or reason? And if so, is that compatible with this idea that knowledge is justified true belief? Here's the puzzle that Plato raises for this view. He says, look, if knowledge rests on a foundation of these basic items, do we know them? And he says, look, here's a puzzle, because if we answer one way, if we say, no, we don't know them, then the things we know rest on things we don't know. Knowledge rests on the unknown. And he says, that seems really problematic. That's a bit like saying, I know the Longhorns will win. Why? Well, because that player's been doing really well in practice, and so is this player, and this player from Oklahoma is hurt. And then you say, well, why do you know any of that? You say, oh, I don't know. I'm just guessing. Then you'll be, oh, man, you don't know after all, right? I mean, it's weird for knowledge to rest on something you don't know. Here's my argument, it's based on this and this and this. Oh, you know those things? Nah. That feels ridiculous. But if you do know them, how can they be justified and yet basic? They're at the bottom level. And so we've said they don't have any other justification. There aren't any independent reasons we can give for those. And so if that's true, how can they be said to be known? It looks like those things that are known but not justified. Well, this is another one of those dialogues that ends with people saying, I guess we don't know what knowledge is. But actually, if you think about this, you realize there are various options. And in a way, all of subsequent epistemology comes out of the trilemma that I think appears here. Here I've mentioned it as a dilemma. Two options. Look, either knowledge rests on the unknown, or we know certain things directly without justification, and both seem problematic, and that Plato seems to be enforcing here. Remember that Socrates demands definitions. You say, let's think about courage. What is courage? And he says, I want a definition of courage. And the same thing happens with self-control, or friendship, or love, or a variety of other things in the early dialogues. Even here, we're looking for a definition of knowledge. It says, look, we won't know what knowledge is unless we can define it. And so there's an assumption. As Socrates puts it, must be able to give a definition and give some justification. And Locke's in that dialogue just says, certainly. Oh, of course. In fact, this is what led us into the puzzle about chairs. We thought we knew what a chair was, and yet we found that we couldn't give a definition of chair. And so by the end we were thinking, wow, maybe we don't know what a chair is after all. Well, how is that relevant, this ability to actually state a definition? Okay? Why does he think that? Sorry, this is rumbling. I don't know what happened there. But anyway, okay, the idea is this. Knowledge requires a justification. If you know that you're sitting in a chair, you better be able to justify that. And in order to give an argument that concludes, I'm sitting in a chair, you must know what a chair is. This is doing it again, isn't it? That's very bad. What can I do to stop it? Besides saying, stop it. There, that worked. Shut it off. Okay. This is what happens when the battery starts dying. So I'll just speak loudly, if that's all right. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Good. Okay, yeah, I can go a lot louder than this, actually. I'm a trained Baroque singer, so I can go very loud if you really want me to. But anyway, yeah, by the way, my bass does the same thing sometimes when the battery's running out. It has going on, and it was like this, it's this sort of cool distortion sound. It was like, I like this, but I have no idea why I'm doing it, right? And then, boom, it was dead. And so that recording has this very neat sound on the bass, but it's one I can't possibly replicate, because it's like, yeah, that's what happens when the battery's just about to die and it's playing its last few notes. Oh well, anyway, I will not subject you to such noises, but I will just sort of speak this way. Why does knowledge require this ability to state a definition? Well, it's because in order to say that this then is knowledge, we have to support that with some kind of reason. And the reason would depend on a definition of knowledge. To be knowledge, it would have to be like this. So, for example, it would have to be this kind of reason. Look, I know this because I believe it, and it's true, or knowledge. So, let's consider an example. That's a triangle. Now, how could you justify your belief that that's a triangle? Yeah?
It has 3 angles.
Good, it has 3 angles. Very nice way to do it. And so you can say, look, I can give you an explanation for that. It's a closed, here's my fancier one, it's a closed plane figure with 3 angles. Okay? Or you might say it has 3 sides, and you know that triangles have 3 sides. Chair. Now, how can we justify the belief that that thing is a chair? Now we say, ooh, right? We've talked about this before. Let's don't go back into that quagmire. But at any rate, we can say, well, I mean, actually, this one's pretty easy, right? It does have 4 legs and a back, and it's a piece of furniture designed for one person to sit on, and so it's like, it's a pretty paradigm chair. It's French. Okay, we've talked about definitions of courage. Here is a poster of, and we could justify some argument that that's courage on the basis of some definition of courage. But now here's the problem. If we think about this in terms of definition, and we're going to look at now just the knowledge equivalent in a moment, you might say, all right, to know something, we've got to be able to define our terms. We've got to be able to state what virtue or courage or self-control or love or friendship or knowledge or justice are. But we define all those things in terms of other things, right? And we use other terms. And then how do we know what those are? We have to have definitions of those, and so on. So you might think, wait a minute. In order to know anything about chairs, I have to be able to find chairs. But suppose I do that in terms of having a back and sides and those definitions. And so why aren't dictionaries infinitely long? It looks like I would, to know what I'm talking about, have to just keep on defining forever. And so with the triangle, we could say, yeah, what do you mean closed plane figure? What are angles? What do you mean by angle? Give me a definition of angle. Give me a definition of side, etc. And you might do that. You might eventually get back to certain primitive terms in geometry, like point, or line, or between, which really are primitives the way most people think about and reconstruct geometry. And if we're thinking about knowledge, we can say, well, how do you know that in a right triangle, the squares of those two sides add up to the square of the hypotenuse? Well, you could prove the Pythagorean theorem. And so you can actually justify all this in terms of axioms, which Euclid states that way. I don't write those down. This is a geometry class. I'm just vaguely reminding you of geometry and the way it's built up. And also, by the way, he puts them in really strange ways because they don't sound like axioms at all. David Hilbert comes up with a more modern axiomatization, and here are his primitives: a line lying on a plane, or a point lying on a line, and then congruence. And he builds all of geometry out of those. Well, anyway, the point is really just that this is a natural way to think about things if you're a foundationalist. You're going to think, here's a body of knowledge. What are the basic assumptions on which it rests? What are the basic concepts in terms of which all the other concepts can be defined? And some of these things, then you'll say, I know directly. Other things you will say, I know or can define in terms of those. Well, let's return to Plato's argument, because it's not so easy when we think about this definition of knowledge to think that takes care of things. If knowledge is justified true belief, the argument goes, it must have a foundation like that, and also gives you all of the truths you need in order to justify everything else. The items in that foundation, we've said, aren't given any further justification. They're basic. They're the given. They are just there. We don't have further reasons for them. But on the other hand, they're known. In fact, they must be known more directly and more securely than anything else, are known without being justified. But wait, we said knowledge was justified true belief. And so we've got a kind of incoherence in this picture. Now, how do we get out of it? What should we say about those basic things? Do we want to say they are in fact justified, even though they don't go on to some further level? Do we say they're not really known? Do we say, oh, they're an exception to this idea that knowledge is justified true belief? What can we do? Can we say the whole picture is wrong? Well, let's look at it in terms of the picture. Here's the idea. Knowledge requires justification. The given, however, it looks like, is known but not justified. And so the stuff at the basic level then can't be known. And so knowledge does rest on the unknown, which is weird, but maybe we can defend it. A second possibility is to say, well, justification, but a justification that doesn't force us into some further level. Or we could say, you know what, this whole picture is wrong. There's something about this that is really misleading, because it implies that everything else rests on some level that then doesn't depend on anything else. And maybe that's the wrong picture. Maybe it's not a layer cake after all. Well, those are the three options that were presented if we want to retain this internalist idea that knowledge is justified true belief. One of these is called classical foundationalism, and it's the view that the given are justified. They are known and they are justified. It's a definition for being self-evident. They justify themselves. You don't have to say anything more. Just say that and people realize, yup. And so sometimes people say the self-evident things are obvious, or everybody assents to them and so on, but the idea is really they justify themselves. Sorry, well, what do I want to say here? Yeah, that they aren't known, that they are in some sense given to us directly without being knowledge. Now that's a little strange, because it gives us that suggestion that somehow we know things on the basis of things that we don't know, and that's weird. But here's the idea. It's not something that's a belief at all. It's something like a perception, a sensation, that is playing that role. And so we don't speak of those things being true. They're not the kind of thing that could be true or false. And then finally, a possibility is that the whole layer cake picture is wrong. And that's called coherentism. The idea there is that knowledge doesn't have any foundation. There is no given. There is no level of ultimate justifiers. Think about the dictionary. Are there any words that are just basic? Do you look at an English dictionary and you look at certain things like on or between, and it just says, hey man, just basic. I mean, you know, you got to know this one. We can't give you I mean, we don't really have that. Occasionally we have little pictures beside things, but still, the dictionary makers never give up. They never just shrug and say, between, man, that, I can't tell you what that is. It's just, and so there's something about the dictionary itself that is sort of coherentist. We define things in terms of other things, those get defined in terms of yet other things, those get defined in other things, and it's all sort of a big web. It's not really a matter of a layer cake at all. So we might end up being, if we stick to this definition anyway, a classical foundationalist who says there are certain truths that are just self-evident. We could be a direct realist who says of these, here's classical foundationalism, the given is just self-evident. It justifies itself. And so there is a relationship of support here, but it just goes to the very same thing. The things at that basic level aren't justified in terms of something else. They justify themselves. The picture of direct realism, the layer cake picture is right. It's just that at the bottom level, you have sense experience. You have perception. And then, coherentism, it's more like a web than a layer cake. Okay, ways. Yeah?
I was reading that one of the beliefs, I don't know which one it is, I kind of believe that it's more of a circle.
Rather than the other, you might say the circle image is actually the pure image. This one, if you're thinking of a web, the web does attach to certain things. And so on a lot of people's view, there are points of like sensation or perception or something like that, experience, that is like where the web attaches. But then within, other things are supported by that in this complex fashion. If you have the circle view, you're not sort of saying, and some are special attachment points, you're saying, forget that. They're all more or less on a par. If you think about the dictionary, for example, all the words are on a par. It's not like some of the words have this direct connection to anything outside the dictionary. And so require the support of the other parts. So it becomes a kind of complicated thing, as we'll see in a moment. I'm being hedgy about answering you just because we start realizing it's way harder to explain than you might think. Why? Well, it depends in a way on what justification is, right? It's a question of a justified true belief being knowledge, but what do we mean? Some beliefs might be justified inferentially. They follow from other justified beliefs. Some, and so we've already talked about inference in connection with externalism. We know what that is. What about intrinsic justification? These are the things that are self-justifying, are self-evident. And then, of course, direct realism says some things are justified by sensation. So now we can say, aha, let's first idea, what are things that could be like that? So, are there beliefs that justify themselves, that are self-evident? And if so, what kinds of beliefs are like that? Any candidates? Yeah?
I think, therefore I am.
Ooh, I think, therefore I am. Okay, good. Descartes is going to give us some very soon. I think. You might say, well, give me the argument that you think. It's like, what do you mean? I just said I think. Okay? How could that be false? Because in saying, well, I guess in saying it, right, I must be thinking it. And if I'm thinking it, gosh, I am thinking. So every time it's thought or uttered, Descartes says, it's got to be true. It justifies it. And you think, what's your argument? How do you know you exist? And I say, I just said it. Who said it? It wasn't me. In order for me to say I exist, I must exist. So there. Now, you may or may not find that convincing, but that's meant to be the idea. The I think really justifies itself. It itself provides the thought that justifies the claim that I think. And the same thing of the I am. Is there anything else that could be like that? Yeah? Emotions or feelings. Very interesting. Miguel Unamuno says, why did Descartes start with the I think? Why didn't he start with the I feel? I feel, therefore I am. How's that one? Now, here is why Descartes didn't do it. The thought, I think, is a thought, and so it justifies the claim that I think. But is my thought that I feel itself a feeling that justifies itself? I think, and so maybe, I guess is all I'll say there. But anyway, respectable philosophers have thought you're right, that emotion could play this sort of role. Even if we don't think it plays it in exactly that way. You could think, look, there's something self-evident about, what exactly would be the claim? Think you love me. What's the argument? And I say, well, I just feel it, right? that would be, that's not much of a justification or argument outside of that to justify my claim. What else could be like this? Well, Descartes, as we've seen, gives those examples, the I think, the I am. What about perception? Actually, I'm looking around for something. Oh yeah, the camera here is black, right? Now, suppose I say, give me a justification for that. How would you justify your claim that the camera is black? Yeah.
It looks black.
It looks black. Okay, good. So you might say, I mean, some people have said something like that's black is just foundational. It's just self-evident that that's black. But maybe you can give a justification. You could say, well, no, it looks black. Or at least it looks black to me now. Maybe it won't tomorrow, and maybe you think it looks like something else. But Roderick Chisholm, who's pictured there, and who looks surprisingly like my colleague Rob Koons, says, you know, here's the way to think of it. I'm being appeared to blackly when I look at the camera. It seems to me, at least, that I'm being appeared to blackly. Now, all of these things are various ways of retreating to something even more basic. But at some point, Chisholm says, you hit something you can't give any further argument for. I say, look, I'm just perceiving something black in front of me. And if somebody says, you know, justify that, at some point I hit the point where I can't do any more justifying. Now, Chisholm thinks something very special about those things that are at the basic level of this, which is that I can't possibly be wrong about them. So that's black. I could be wrong. It might be that I'm misperceiving it. The lighting could be confusing. It looks black. How could I be wrong about that? So some people would say, yeah, I can't be wrong about that. Others would say, well, maybe I am confused about the way things seem to me. And so even it looks black to me now. Maybe I'm somehow confused about my own mental states, and I don't know how things look to me. That's sort of odd, but maybe I could tell you a science fiction-y story that would be, by looking at the camera, how could I really be wrong about that? So the attempt here is, in a way, not only to find premises, but to try to find premises I really couldn't be wrong about. Though he is, in general, somebody who is an empiricist, he does think that certain moral truths are self-evident, like you ought to seek the good, you ought to avoid evil. And those might be things. And then you could talk about inference. And here I've got a clip that I can't show you because I can't download the stupid file. It's a Monty Python thing that I should have showed you earlier. It's not playing. I'll come back to it later if I can get it to play. Okay, well, I want to talk now about this as well. Justified true belief. Is that what knowledge is? Let's go back to our standard way of thinking about definitions. We've got the things in the dark circle there that are known. Then we've got the things that fit this definition, are justified true beliefs. Those are the square. And now we can ask, are there any false negatives? Are there any false positives? Yeah?
I feel like if you believe that aliens exist, and you're like, oh, well, mathematically, like, aliens are likely to exist, and you're like, I know that aliens exist, but you don't really know that aliens exist until, like, you have
Okay, good. Yeah, here's a case where somebody believes that aliens exist. And let's just grant for the sake of argument that they do, okay? That the person has a true belief that they're right. And now, do they have any justification? Do they have any account? You say, well, why do you think there are aliens? And then they give you this mathematical argument about probabilities and, you know, how many planets there might be in the universe and how many of those planets might have life and blah, 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 blah. I've seen arguments like this given, so it's not an impossible thought. In fact, it's arguments like this that were used to justify the SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project. And so you could end up saying, the person might say, yeah, look, I have a belief, and we're from the outside saying, okay, grant that it's true, and then saying, aha, I've got a justification. Does that person know there is life on other planets? You might think, I don't think you can know that. I mean, you can give some kind of argument. Maybe you can say it, you think it has a certain probability and so on, but somehow it feels like, until I see the little green men, I'm not going to believe it, right? And I'm not going to believe that you know it. And so there are certain kinds of arguments that supply some support, but on the other hand, don't seem to supply enough support. Suppose I say tomorrow, I know the Longhorns will win. And why do I know that? Because burnt orange is such a pretty color that the other team will. But it's a reason, right? Some argument, it's a justification. You say, yeah, even if it turns out I'm right and they win, you wouldn't say, oh, Bonnebeck knew it because you have this color thing. That doesn't seem like enough of an argument. And so there might be a way of saying, yeah, look, I think there are things in that outer part of the square, okay, that would count as false positives. Are there other things that would be false negatives? Could you have things that you know for which you have no justification? Yeah.
Well, we know this is wrong, but not wrong, rather necessary for sufficient. What we see later with Edmund Gettier, that that we can have justified true beliefs, but then have some element of love or something we could not predict that proves us right, but we didn't necessarily know.
Ah, okay, good, yes. If we're thinking about the things that could be in that square outside of the circle, the things that could count as false positives here, it's not just cases where we have a justification, but it's not really strong enough. There are also cases where we have quite a strong justification, but actually we just luck out. It's the justification plus a certain element of luck we want to say we know. So in a moment we're going to look at a couple of those cases in detail. But yes, there are cases like that where it feels like, wait a minute, man, you did have a justification, and it wasn't really a weak or thin justification, it was a pretty decent one. But nevertheless, it feels like you really just got lucky, and so we don't count it as knowledge. Yeah?
What about, like, how you know about certain, like, feelings or things that are going on in your mind about that? Like, you can't give exact evidence because it's all in your head, but at the same time, does that mean it's...
Ooh, all right, good. Yeah, what about some intuitive judgments? Where, I don't know, let's say, you've been in this relationship with somebody, and then all of them, they break up with you. And you suddenly say, yeah, well, I couldn't explain it. I just had this feeling like, things aren't so good. And then, when it came, I wasn't entirely surprised. So I could say, hey, I knew it was going to happen. And yet if you said, why? What was your argument? What was your justification? Well, I said, I don't know. I just had this feeling. Or, here's another way in which these kinds of intuitions can matter. You walk into a situation, and you might right away sense, ooh, something's wrong. Like, walk into a room full of people, and they've just been having some kind of argument. You didn't hear the argument at all. You just walk in. But you right away get the sense, what have I just stepped into, right? Something's wrong. And if somebody said, right, I've just got this feeling, I've got this intuitive support, but I can't give you anything more than that. Now you might think, in general, some of them might be based on feelings or intuitions. Some of them might be just factual things. What's the capital of Malaysia? Nobody knows? That's bad. That's weird, right? I wouldn't know how to justify that. What's the numerical value of pi to do 2 decimal places? 3.14. Justify it. What's your argument? Right? I don't know what to say. Who invented the cotton gin? Eli Whitney, yeah. Suppose I can justify that. What's your argument? Yeah, I just remember it, right? It's one of those facts that somebody jammed into my head at some point. In what year did Lee surrender the grant to mathematics? 1865, good. But again, if I ask for a justification, you might not remember where you first heard that or how you learned it or anything else. Who is Lisa Simpson's teacher on The Simpsons? No, it's like you got to just remember that. I don't know how to justify it. Or at least without showing you pictures. I can't give reasons, but I think I know. And indeed, the externalists can say, of course, you remember them, or you perceive them, or this type of thing. But now, let's turn to the other question, the false positive question about sufficiency. Is justified true belief enough? Well, we might worry that it's not enough. You could be justified, and you could be right, but you could actually have this character, but Russell doesn't make a big deal of it. But Gettier wrote a famous paper in 1965, since Ned's upstanding and hardworking, and Homer isn't. And he also has strong evidence that Ned has 10 coins in his pocket. Let's say they were both waiting for the interviewer. They went over to the soda machines, and he saw Ned counting out his coins to see if he had enough to get a Coke. Well, Homer concludes, and he's got a justification for concluding, that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, suppose, however, he turns out to be right, but because Homer will get the job, and he doesn't even realize it, but there in his pocket are 10 coins. So it turns out he's got a belief-cation. But in this case, do we say that he knew? It feels weird, right? Because he got lucky. It just so happened that he and Ned had the same number of coins in their pocket. And so it's a weird sort of situation. He's right, he's got a justification, he's got the belief, but we're reluctant to say that he knows. There's another case in that paper about keys. Somebody sees somebody's key and says, well, that's a key to a Ford. Actually, well, this doesn't work anymore because I don't have the same car, and neither does my daughter. But it used to work nicely because I used to have 2 Mazda keys on my key ring, and one was to my Mazda and one was to my daughter's Mazda. And you might see the daughter's key and say, aha, he drives a Mazda. But it's like, well, I do, but you're seeing the wrong key. That's not my car. Well, anyway, never mind. Here's a better or a more entertaining example. Homer thinks that he'll plant a flag on the top of the murder horn. He has a justification. He's going to eat power sauce bars that are going to give him great strength. And it turns out he's right. He ends up on the top of the mountain, but not for the reason he thinks. Does he know?